The question occurs on the motion to report the resolution H.J.Res 114 favorably. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the motion report
Recorded vote is requested.
favorably is adopted.
Mr. Chairman, may we have a recorded vote?
Very well. The clerk will call the roll. This is final passage.
Mr. Gilman.
Aye.
Mr. Gilman votes yes. Mr. Leach.
No.
Mr. Leach votes no. Mr. Bereiter. Mr. Bereiter votes yes. Mr. Smith. Mr. Burton. Mr. Gallagly. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen.
Yes.
Ms. Ross-Lehtinen votes yes. Mr. Ballinger. Mr. Ballinger votes yes. Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Rohrabacher votes yes. Mr. Royce.
Royce, yes.
Mr. Royce votes yes. Mr. King.
Yes.
Mr. King votes yes. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Houghton. Mr. McHugh. Mr. Cooksey. Mr. Tancredo. Mr. Tancredo votes yes. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul votes no. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes yes. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Issa.
Issa, yes.
Mr. Issa votes yes. Mr. Cantor.
Aye.
Mr. Cantor votes yes. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake votes yes. Mr. Kearns.
Aye.
Mr. Kearns votes yes. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes yes. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes yes. Mr. Lantos.
Yes.
Mr. Lantos votes yes. Mr. Berman. Mr. Berman votes yes. Mr. Ackerman. Mr. Ackerman votes yes. Mr. Faleomavaenga. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Menendez.
No is offered.
Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Ms. McKinney.
I don't think there's any doubt. A very strong no.
Ms. McKinney votes no. Mr. Hilliard.
No.
Mr. Hilliard votes no. Mr. Sherman.
Yes.
Mr. Sherman votes yes. Mr. Wexler. Mr. Wexler votes yes. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes yes. Mr. Engel.
Yes.
Mr. Engel votes yes. Mr. Delahunt.
No.
Mr. Delahunt votes no. Mr. Meeks.
No.
Mr. Meeks votes no. Ms. Lee. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Huffle. Mr. Huffle votes yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Ms. Berkeley. Ms. Berkeley votes yes. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff votes yes. Ms. Watson. Mr. Hyde.
Aye.
Mr. Hyde votes yes.
Mr. Burton.
Mr. Burton is not recorded.
I will vote yes.
Mr. Burton votes yes.
Mr. Shabbat.
Mr. Shabbat votes yes.
Mr. Chris Smith.
Yes.
Mr. Smith votes yes.
Mr. McHugh.
Mr. McHugh votes yes.
Mr. Pitts.
Mr. Pitts votes yes.
Have all voted who wish. The clerk will report. Clerk will
Mr.
report.
Chairman, on this vote, there are 31 ayes and 11 noes.
And the motion is agreed to. My congratulations to the committee,
Mr. Chairman,
the gentlelady from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to request that members have the opportunity to file dissenting and additional views as well as extraneous material to be included in the report accompanying the resolution.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlelady will, of course, be granted that privilege. However, in order for the House to have the benefit of the committee's report and the gentlelady's views prior to the floor consideration, I would ask the gentlelady's cooperation in submitting her views for inclusion in the report by the close of business tomorrow. This will enable the report to be assembled, filed, and printed in a timely manner. Would the gentlelady agree with that?
Mr. Chairman, is there any way possible it could be to the close of business on Monday?
Monday morning? Can we?
Okay, Monday morning. What time, Mr. Chairman?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock Monday morning. It's
Yes,
agreed.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Brown.
Just an inquiry, Ms. Lee and Mr. Watson, and Ms. Watson, who expressed their votes, those were not actually, who expressed their desire or position, those were not actually counted in the votes, is that correct?
No, the votes cannot be counted unless you're here.
I would just say, Mr. Chairman, that something as important as this, that the media at least understand that there were at least 2 more votes in this committee of people, or 3 more, counting Mr. Oden, at least 3 more when they look at the vote count here of
Well,
people that
Mr.
were-
Faleoma Vega would have voted the other way, so.
Well, if those other ones announced, then okay, that's fine.
Without objection, the preamble and the resolving clauses shall each be reported as single amendments incorporating any, well, there were no amendments adopted by the, except my amendment, that's right. Without objection, chairman is authorized to move to go to conference pursuant to House Rule 22. Without objection, staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes. The committee stands adjourned. Pete, thank you, sir. Thank you for your...
Here's what's on C-SPAN this weekend.